There are some stories that don't begin with a gun or a fight, they begin with silence. The kind of silence that comes after loss, when the wind has nothing left to say and the land feels heavy with what it remembers. Martha lived on the edge of that silence. Her home sat where the fields turned to stone and the river gave up its voice. She had 2 sons and no husband, and every inch of her land carried the echo of the man she once loved. The townsfolk said she was a hard woman, not cruel, just shaped by time the way rock is shaped by rain. Every morning before the sun rose, she would step out on the porch and watch the light crawl across the valley. She never smiled at it. She just waited for it to reach the barn. That was her mark to begin the day. Her boys were still young when their father died. They grew up working harder than most men. They learned to mend fences before they could spell their own names. They rode bareback through dry creeks and dreamed of nothing beyond the hills they could see. Life didn't give them room for dreaming. The town was small, a single street of dust and tired boards, a church that leaned with the wind, a saloon that never slept, and a post office that brought more sorrow than joy. That was where it happened one morning in late summer. The stranger rode in slow. His horse was dark and lean, the kind of horse that had seen more miles than mercy. His coat was worn, his hat pulled low. He didn't look around. He just stopped in front of the post office and tied his reins with a care that said he wasn't in a hurry. Folks in town noticed him the way people notice thunder in the distance. They didn't speak, just watched. He stepped inside and the door swung shut behind him. When he came out, he had something in his hand. A letter. Martha was standing by her wagon loading feed. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across her. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried dust and distance. "Are you Martha Ellery?" She nodded slow. "I am." He held out the letter. "This is for you." She wiped her hands on her apron and took it. The paper felt old. The seal cracked when she touched it. She looked at the name written across the front and her breath caught somewhere deep. It was her husband's name. She looked back at the stranger. His face didn't give her anything, just the faint look of a man who'd carried too many messages and seen too little peace. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From a man who said you'd know what it means." Her eyes searched his. "Is he alive?" The stranger's silence was an answer. He tipped his hat and turned away. That night the letter sat on the table between the 3 of them. The boys watched it like it might move on its own. Martha didn't open it right away. She just sat with her hands folded and her eyes far off. When she finally broke the seal, the paper trembled in her hands. It was written in her husband's hand, the same careful script she had seen on every note he ever left on the mantel before heading out for cattle drives. "My dearest Martha, if this finds you, it means I didn't make it home. I reckon there are things I never told you and debts I never paid. There's a man out there who carries something that belongs to you. If he comes one day, treat him kindly. What he brings might not be gold, but it's worth more than you'll ever know." The letter ended there. No name, no place, just that promise that someone would come. Her sons looked at her with questions she couldn't answer. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the coyotes started their long cry. The next morning, the stranger was gone. His tracks led south, but his shadow stayed. Days turned slow after that. Martha went about her work, but something in her had shifted. She caught herself looking toward the road when the wind changed. She'd find reasons to go into town even when there was no need. The boys noticed too. They didn't speak of it. It just worked harder. A week passed then too. The letter sat on the mantel like a ghost that refused to leave. Then one night the dogs started barking. Martha stepped outside with a lantern and saw a rider coming up the trail. The same dark horse, the same slow gait. The stranger stopped at the gate. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "I need a place to rest." Her voice was calm, but her heart wasn't. "You found it once. You can find it again," he nodded. "I didn't think you'd invite me." "I didn't," she said. "But I reckon I owe you supper for bringing that letter." He dismounted and followed her to the porch. Inside, the boys sat quiet. The younger one whispered, "Is that him?" Martha didn't answer. She set a place at the table. The stranger ate slow and spoke little. When he finished, he set his hat on the table and said, "Your husband saved my life once. I carried that letter because he asked me to. But there's more he wanted you to have." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He set it down gently. Inside were 3 gold coins and a folded scrap of cloths. The cloth had a name stitched into it, their eldest son's. Martha stared at it. Her voice was barely there. "Where did he get this?" "From a man he spared," the stranger said. "Said it was all he had to give. Your husband didn't keep much for himself." The room went still. The lantern flickered and shadows moved across the wall like the past itself, breathing through the cracks. The stranger stood. "He wanted you to know he kept his word. Whatever else he did wrong, he made it right before the end." Martha's eyes softened, though no tears came. She nodded once. "Thank you." He picked up his hat. "I'll be gone by sunrise." She didn't stop him. But when the door closed behind him, she stood there long after he was gone. The letter and the cloth lay side by side on the table. 2 pieces of a man who had loved her in ways the world could never understand. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, then faded into silence. And for the first time in years, Martha whispered his name, not in grief but in peace. Morning came soft and gray. The kind of morning that feels like the world is holding its breath before it starts again. The boys were already at work when Martha stepped outside. She watched the light break over the ridge and thought about the man who had ridden away before dawn. His tracks were still fresh in the dirt road leading out of the valley. She followed them with her eyes until they disappeared into the low mist. Something about him had stayed behind though. The quiet he carried now lived inside her house. Days passed like that. The same chores, the same meals, the same quiet evenings. But something in her days had changed shape. She caught herself looking at the road again, not in hope exactly, more in the way someone looks at a wound they thought had healed. Then one afternoon as the sun sank low and the sky turned the color of burnished copper, she saw dust rising on the horizon. A rider again. Slow, deliberate, the same horse, the same dark coat. He rode up to the gate and stopped. "You again," she said, though her voice wasn't unkind. "Me again," he said with a nod. "Thought you'd gone for good." "I did," he said, "but something brought me back." She waited. The silence between them stretched wide. "I've been carrying a debt," he said finally. "Your husband wasn't just a man who saved my life. He was the reason I started living it again. I figure you deserve to know the truth of what that means." She studied his face. There was a kind of weight there, not the weight of lies, but of something long carried. She opened the gate. "Then you'd best come inside." The boys watched as he stepped through the door again. This time he took off his hat and held it in his hands like a man in church. He sat at the same table where the letter still rested under a small stone to keep it from the wind. "I was a thief once," he said, "a drifter. Took what I needed and left before morning. I'd been running from a bounty and a noose when your husband found me bleeding near the canyon. He could have left me there. Would have been easier, but he didn't." Martha's hands stilled on the table. "He patched me up," the stranger went on. "Fed me, gave me a place in his camp. Told me a man could start over if he was willing to pay the price. I didn't believe him then. I barely believe it now. But before he died he made me promise something." He reached into his coat again. This time he brought out a folded page worn from being opened too many times. "It was another letter. He said to give you this only when I'd kept my word," he said. Martha took it. The paper trembled between her fingers. She unfolded it slow. "If this finds you, Martha, it means I did something right before I left this earth. There's a man named Eli Ull come to know by what he carries, not what he says. Treat him as you would have treated me if I'd come home. He's trying to be better. I reckon that's worth something. Your husband." She set the letter down. Her eyes lifted to meet Eli's. "So that's your name." He nodded once. "It is now." The room went quiet again except for the sound of the fire. "You could have left that letter with the first one," she said. "I could have," he said, "but I hadn't earned the right then." She studied him. There was no pride in his voice, just a steady truth that seemed carved into him by years of living rough. She stood and walked to the window. The sky was turning dark again. Out past the barn the hills stretched endless and bare. "You've done what he asked," she said at last. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," Eli said, "but I owe him. And there's something else you should know." He reached into his saddlebag and laid out a small leather ledger. The edges were frayed, the pages filled with names and numbers written in a rough hand. "Your husband had land rights out near the North Ridge," he said. "He paid for them fair, but the deed never reached the records office. The man who carried it was killed in a raid. I found it years later in the ruins of an old wagon. I thought it was lost. When I saw your name I knew it wasn't by chance." Martha stared at the ledger. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why bring it now?" "Because he wanted you to have it. Said it was meant for your sons. He built something out there that no one ever saw finished." Her eyes softened, then darkened with something like pain. "You mean his dreams? He spoke of that land every night. Said it was where he'd take us when the work here was done." Eli nodded. "It's still there, empty, waiting." For a long moment no one spoke. The fire cracked. The boys exchanged glances, neither understanding the weight of what had just been given. When Eli rose to leave, Martha stopped him. "If you're telling the truth about that land, you'll show me." He looked at her with a flicker of surprise. "It's a long ride. I've ridden farther," she said. He gave a slow nod. "Then I'll wait for sunrise." That night she didn't sleep. The wind moved across the house like it was searching for something. She sat by the fire holding both letters in her lap. Her husband's words seemed to hum through the room like a ghost breathing softly. By morning the sky had turned pale and wide. She saddled her horse before the boys were awake. Eli stood by the gate already mounted. They rode north. The valley opened before them in colors of rust and gold. The air smelled of rain, though no clouds hung above. For hours they rode in silence. The land rolled on endless. Hills gave way to flat earth and dry creek beds. Bones of old cattle lay half buried in dust. By midday they reached a rise that looked out over a long stretch of grass. "There," Eli said. "That's where he meant to build." Martha dismounted. The wind pulled at her shawl as she stepped forward. The ground was rough and uneven. A few stones marked what might once have been a foundation. She knelt and touched the earth. It was dry but warm beneath her fingers. Eli watched her from a few paces away. "He talked about you every night," he said. "He said you were the only reason he ever came home." After they'd eaten, she stepped outside. The air was cool and sweet. Eli followed her. They stood in silence for a long while until she said softly, "Maybe some debts can't be paid. Maybe they can only be lived." Eli looked toward the ridge where the sun was sinking behind the hills. "Maybe that's enough," he said. The wind stirred between them and carried the scent of the rain and the earth, and the faint promise of something like peace. But far off down the road beyond the edge of the valley, dust was rising again, and with it came the shape of riders moving slow and sure toward the widow's land. The past, it seemed, was not quite done with them yet. The days that followed were quiet but not empty. The widow and her boys began to visit the ridge each morning after chores. Eli rode with them, though he never said much. He would walk the land slow, his boots sinking into the dry soil as if he were reading something written there long ago. The boys liked him. They followed him around, asking questions about horses and fences and guns. He answered only when he had to, but his words carried weight. Martha watched from a distance and saw how her sons stood taller around him, how they seemed to find purpose in his silence. The air began to cool in the evenings. Autumn drifted across the valley, bringing long shadows and a faint smell of wood smoke from cabins far off. The land at the ridge was slowly changing too. What had once been barren began to hold promise. The boys cleared rocks, built a fence from fallen timber. Eli showed them how to drive posts, how to tie rope tight so the wind wouldn't tear it loose. At night, the four of them would sit near the fire. The flames would dance on their faces and the air would hum with the sound of crickets. Martha would sometimes look at Eli and see something soft behind the hard lines of his face. She wondered if he carried guilt or sorrow or both. One evening she asked him, "You speak little about what came before. You said my husband saved you, but what did you do after that?" Eli sat for a long time before answering, "I tried to do what he said, to make something of myself, but a man's past doesn't die easy. I worked ranches down south, kept my head down, then I heard word of a wagon train ambushed near the border. The name of your husband was among those lost. I rode there myself, found the deed to this land and what was left. Took me years to bring it back." Martha's eyes lowered to the flames. "Years," she whispered. "You could have come sooner." "I wasn't ready," Eli said. "A man has to earn peace before he gives it away." The night pressed in around them. The boys had fallen asleep. The fire popped and cracked. Martha stared into it and saw her husband's face as she remembered it the day he left. She had watched him ride out with a promise that he would return before the first snow. He never did. Now the man who had carried his last words sat across from her, silent and still. The next morning Eli rode into town for supplies. The people there looked at him like they always looked at strangers. Some nodded, some didn't. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. Behind the counter, the storekeeper gave a slow nod. "Heard you've been spending time out near the ridge." Eli met his eyes. "That's right. You might want to be careful. That land's been watched by folks who say it ain't yours." "It ain't," Eli said. "It's hers." The storekeeper gave a quiet chuckle. "A widow trying to claim land without a man's name beside it. That's a hard thing in these parts." Eli's jaw tightened. "Then maybe that's something that needs changing." When he returned to the ranch that evening, Martha saw the worry in his face. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated. "Word spreading about the land. Some men think they can take it." Her eyes darkened. "We won't run." "I know," he said, "but you should be ready." From then on, he kept watch at night. He'd sit on the porch with his rifle across his knees, listening to the wind move through the grass. Sometimes Martha would bring him coffee. They'd stand there without speaking, both staring at the horizon where the moon hung like a coin in the dark. One night he said quietly, "Your husband was brave, but he wasn't a fool. He knew a man can't fight forever. He told me once that peace costs something. I never knew what he meant until now." Martha looked at him. What did he mean? Eli took a slow breath. "He meant that when you find something worth protecting, you stop running from who you were. You stand your ground." She looked out at the dark ridge and nodded. "Then we'll stand." The next week was filled with work. The boys drove stakes, built a small shelter out near the ridge. Martha cooked bread and stew and carried water from the well. Eli helped with everything, but she could see he was restless. Sometimes he'd ride off for hours without saying where he was going. One day she followed. From a distance she watched him stop by a lonely oak tree near the edge of the ridge. He knelt there for a long time, his hat pressed to his chest. When he rose, he looked heavier than before. That night she asked him about it. "There's something buried out there, isn't there?" He nodded slow. "Your husband's saddle, and the bullet that took him. I found them years ago. Thought it best to leave them where they fell." Martha's breath caught. "You were there." Eli didn't meet her eyes. "I was close enough to hear the shots. He went down fighting. I tried to reach him, but by the time I did, he was gone. He told me to run, said it wasn't my time." He was right, but I've been trying to make it right ever since. The truth hung between them, heavy and hollow. Martha's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "You could have told me sooner. I didn't think you'd forgive me. I don't know if I can," she said, "but I can see that you've carried it long enough." Eli gave a small nod. "I'll keep working the land. When it's ready, it'll be yours and the boys. Then I'll ride on." She wanted to argue, but didn't. Some truths didn't need more words. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind roared through the valley, tearing at the roof and shaking the barn doors. Martha and the boys worked to keep the fire lit, while Eli ran out into the rain to tie the horses. Lightning split the sky, white and blinding. When it was over, the land was soaked, and the fence near the ridge had fallen. Eli and the boys went out at dawn to repair it. The ground was slick and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. As they worked, Martha stood watching from the porch. She saw the way Eli moved, the way he lifted the posts and steadied her sons when they stumbled. There was something almost fatherly in his quiet care. By the time the fence was fixed, the sun had broken through the clouds. Light spilled across the ridge, and for a brief moment the land looked alive again. That evening, Martha cooked a meal from what little was left in the pantry. The boys laughed and told stories, and Eli listened with a faint smile. It was the first time in years she'd heard laughter fill her home without it hurting. The dawn came slow and uneasy. The air held a stillness that didn't belong. Even the birds kept quiet. Out beyond the ridge, a thin line of dust rose into the pale morning light. Eli stood on the porch with his hand resting on the rifle that never left his side. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Martha saw it in his eyes. The past had finally found its way back. By noon, the riders were closer. 4 men, maybe 5. Dark coats, hard eyes, the kind of men who didn't come for talk. The oldest of them led the rest. His face was leathered and his hat sat low. He rode with the slow confidence of someone who had taken too much and never been told no. Martha sent the boys inside. They watched from the window, wide-eyed and silent. Eli stayed still at the gate waiting, his posture calm, his face unreadable. The men stopped a few yards away. Dust hung around them like smoke. The leader smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "You, Eli Ward." Eli's voice was low and steady. "I am." The man tilted his head. "Heard you been meddling with land that ain't yours. It belongs to the woman who lives here. The deed says her husband's name." The man spat into the dirt. "That deed was supposed to be ours. We paid for it in blood." Eli's eyes darkened. "You paid for nothing. You took what wasn't yours, then left men dead for it, including one who saved my life." The air between them went sharp. The other men shifted in their saddles. The leader gave a dry laugh. "Then I guess you're here to settle what's left." Eli raised his chin. "If that's how it has to be." The man grinned. "It always has to be." He signaled his men. They spread out, slow, their hands hovering near their holsters. Martha watched from the porch, her heart pounding. The boys clung to her dress, too scared to breathe. Eli stood his ground. The wind tugged at his coat. Dust swirled around his boots. Time stretched thin like the moment before thunder breaks. Then it happened fast. A flash of motion. A single gunshot that tore through the stillness. One of the riders fell. The others fired wild. The sound echoed across the valley like a storm rolling through the bones of the earth. Eli moved like someone who'd been here before, calm and sure, each shot deliberate, each breath steady. He wasn't fighting for pride. He was fighting to keep what little peace he'd found. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay still. The leader was bleeding but alive. He stared up at Eli, his voice ragged. "You think this makes you clean?" Eli shook his head. "No, just done." He lowered the gun and stepped back. But the man wasn't finished. With a sudden snarl, he reached for his pistol. The sound that followed was final. Eli stood there breathing hard, the rifle slipping from his grasp. His sleeve was wet with blood. Martha ran to him, her voice breaking. "You're hurt. It's not bad," he said, though his face said otherwise. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against his arm. The boys came out trembling. Eli knelt and put a hand on each of their shoulders. "You did good staying inside. You protect your mother now, always." They nodded, though they didn't understand why his voice sounded like goodbye. That evening, the sheriff came up the road. He looked over the bodies, then at Eli. "Looks like trouble found you." Eli nodded. "It usually does." The sheriff sighed. "These men were wanted for murder in 3 counties. You did what the law couldn't." "I didn't do it for the law." "I know," the sheriff said quietly. "You'll need to come to town tomorrow. Give a statement. After that, you're free to go." Free to go. The words sat heavy in the air. That night, the house was silent. Martha lit a single candle on the table. The flame flickered against the walls and cast long shadows that looked almost alive. Eli sat nearby, his arm bandaged, his gaze distant. She poured him coffee, though his hands shook too much to hold it. "You could stay," she said softly. "The land's big enough for all of us." Eli shook his head slow. "This was never mine. It was his dream. I just brought it home. You don't have to keep running." He looked at her then. "Some men are built for wandering, and some are built for roots. I think I always knew which one I was." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. "The boys look up to you. They need someone like you." He smiled faintly. "Then teach them to be better than me. Teach them not to waste their lives trying to fix what's already done." The candle burned low. Outside, the crickets sang again. The storm had passed, but the scent of gunpowder still lingered, faint and bitter. When morning came, he was already saddling his horse. The boys ran out, still half asleep. "Where are you going?" the youngest asked. Eli looked down at them. "To finish something I started long ago." Martha stepped onto the porch. The rising sun caught her hair and turned it to gold. "Will you ever come back?" Eli didn't answer right away. He looked at the ridge where the light was spilling across the fence and the fields they had built together. "Maybe one day," he said finally. "When the wind forgets my name." He reached into his coat and handed her the folded deed. "Keep this safe. It's all that's left of him, and maybe of me too." She took it, her hands trembling. "You have nothing left to prove," she whispered. He gave a small nod, then turned his horse toward the open road. The hooves beat a slow, steady rhythm against the dirt. The sound carried long after he was gone. For a long time Martha stood there watching until the horizon swallowed him whole. The boys stood beside her, silent, their faces caught between pride and sorrow. The wind rose gently through the valley, lifting the dust and the scent of cedar. It whispered through the grass and over the ridge and carried the story of a man who had lost everything yet found a way to give something back. That day the widow buried the past with her own hands. She mended the fence. She sowed the field. And as the sun dipped low, she saw the land bathed in light, soft and golden. For the first time in years it looked alive. She knew then that peace wasn't something you found, it was something you built from what remained. But far off on the road that led west, a lone rider moved through the fading light, his hat pulled low, his coat torn, his heart heavy but still beating. He didn't look back. Men like him rarely did. Yet somewhere deep inside he carried the echo of laughter and the warmth of a home he would never claim. And though he was gone, his promise lingered like the last note of a hymn sung to a dying sun. Years passed, quiet and steady, like a river wearing down stone. The land changed slow but sure. The widow's hands grew rougher, yet her spirit never did. The boys grew taller, their faces taking the shape of men before she was ready to let them go. Seasons rolled through the valley, painting it gold and gray and green again. Life had found a way to keep moving even when grief tried to hold it still. Every spring, the younger boy rode out to the ridge where the wind was strong. He said he could still hear hoofbeats out there, faint but steady. His mother never told him it was only the wind. Maybe it wasn't. The ranch grew in time. Neighbors came to trade. Some came to stay. A new barn went up. A well was dug deeper. Each nail, each plank, each patch of earth was a promise that the past could still grow something good. At night, Martha would sit on the porch, her eyes on the stars. She often thought about that letter that started it all. A piece of paper that had brought a stranger to her door and changed the shape of her life. She kept it folded in a box with her husband's old watch and a single bullet wrapped in cloth. The watch no longer ticked. The bullet never fired. Both were reminders of the men she had lost and the one she could never forget. The townsfolk spoke of Eli Ward sometimes, the drifter who rode in one summer and left before winter's first frost. Some said he'd been seen out near the border country working cattle or breaking horses. Others swore he'd taken to the mountains to live among the silence. But those were just stories. The kind that grow in small towns when folks want to believe that the good in a man like him doesn't just fade away. The truth was simpler. No one knew where he went. Maybe not even Eli himself. The older boy took over the ranch when he turned 20. He worked the land with the same quiet patience his mother had. He spoke little but carried a steadiness that folks trusted. The younger boy left for town for a while to learn the trade of smithing. When he came back, he built new fences, stronger ones. He said they'd last through any storm. One evening when the air was cool and the sun was sitting low behind the hills, a rider came up the long road that led to the house. He was older, gray in the beard, his coat faded from sun and time. The boys saw him first. They stepped onto the porch, their hands hovering near the rifles, though not out of fear, just habit. The man dismounted slow. His movements carried a weight that spoke of long miles. He nodded once. "You boys grown tall," he said. His voice was gravel and wind. They stared a moment before the younger whispered Eli. He smiled just enough to show it was him. "Didn't think you'd remember." They ran to him then both at once. He braced himself with a laugh that broke through years of silence. Martha came out next, her hand over her mouth. Time had marked her face, but her eyes were the same. She walked to him slow, unsure if he was real. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said softly. Her voice trembled. "I thought you were gone." "I was," he said, "for a while." The air held still. Then she reached out and touched his arm as if to prove he was flesh and not dust. "You look tired," she said. "I've been chasing peace," he replied. "It runs faster than a man my age." They all laughed, though tears filled their eyes. That night they sat around the table again for the first time in years. The lamp cast a golden glow across their faces. The boys told him how the land had changed, how the fences held strong, and how the well never ran dry. He listened quiet, smiling now and then. Martha poured him coffee. "You still take it black," he nodded. "Ain't learned a new trick yet." Later, when the house was dark and the others asleep, he stepped out onto the porch. The stars hung heavy and bright. The land stretched out before him, wide and forgiving. Martha joined him, a shawl around her shoulders. They stood in silence for a long while. The night wind carried the soft scent of pine and dust. "You staying this time?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon where the sky met the hills. "I don't know," he said. "Seems the road keeps calling." "Maybe it's time to stop answering," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But some men are meant to keep riding, even when there's nowhere left to go. She studied him a moment, then nodded. If that's who you are, I reckon the world's a little better for it. He turned to her. And you made this place into something good. Your husband would have been proud. Her eyes shone in the starlight. I think he'd have thanked you for everything. Eli shook his head. You don't thank a man for doing what's right. You just hope he remembers why it mattered. They stood there until dawn painted the sky pale gold. When the first rooster crowed, he saddled his horse again. The boys came out to see him off. Where will you go? The younger asked. Eli smiled. Where the wind points. Always does. The older one handed him a small pouch, something to eat on the way. Ma made it. He took it with a nod. You take care of her and this land. She built it with more heart than most men ever find. We will, they said together. Martha stood beside them. You'll always have a place here, she said quietly. He tipped his hat. That's more than most men ever get. Then he turned and rode out slow. The sun rose behind him, setting the fields aglow. His shadow stretched long across the ground, then faded into the dust. The boys watched until he was gone. Martha stayed there longer, her hand resting on the post, the wind tugging at her shawl. She didn't cry. She just breathed deep and let the morning fill her lungs. Years later, folks would still talk about the widow and the drifter, about how he came with a letter that changed everything and left with nothing but peace. Some said he was seen again out west helping strangers the way he once helped her. Some said he found a quiet place to rest his bones. But those who knew Martha knew she never doubted where he'd gone. She said the good ones don't disappear. They just become part of the wind that keeps the world turning. And on still nights when the moon hung low and the crickets sang soft, you could stand by that porch and swear you heard the faint rhythm of hoofs fading into the horizon. A sound like a man carrying his past into forever. A sound like peace at last.